Welcome to Module 4. We're now going to respond to the questions that were put to us, and we're going to start with the section of the module that deals with the prevention of violence against women. So I will be answering 5 different questions that I selected from those that you posed after reading the module. If we can go to question 1. The question was, how can one combine the need for a multi-sectoral approach, which implies various simultaneous interventions, with an experimental evaluation? Does this make sense from an ethical point of view, given that we are talking about women in situations of violent victimization where we want to avoid more violence or even death? This is a very good question. It shows that you've been reading the module, and it shows you're conscious of ethical problems. In terms of my answer to this question, I would say, first of all, that there are factorial experimental designs that take into account multi-sectoral approaches, in that it is not unusual when we do experimental evaluations to have to evaluate an intervention which is multi-pronged. Many interventions with offenders are multi-pronged, and therefore there is more than one type of intervention or independent variable occurring at any one time. So there are research designs that allow us to do this. Perhaps more importantly, I think it's good to clarify that not all evaluations need to be experiments. There are non-experimental designs in place that have a similar level of methodological rigor, and for that reason, we can always consider in these types of cases a non-experimental evaluation. In terms of ethics, yes, it is very problematic to experiment with samples of women that are undergoing situations of violent victimization. And for this, we can go to the next slide. I would recommend a publication from the World Health Organization that details what kind of ethical principles must be taken into consideration when we are doing research that evaluates violence against women. In particular, the most important principle in these kinds of research has to do with the security and safety of the women who are participating in the experience, as well as the research team. That is the most important principle. But on the next slide, if you would show it, you will see a diagram from this World Health Organization report, which goes over recommendations for this kind of evaluation research. So A, yes, details that the safety of respondents and the research team should guide all project decisions. B, details that prevalence studies need to be methodologically sound and need to build upon current research about how to minimize the underreporting of violence, given that in many research studies, the results might be that violence against women has increased, but there is a chronic problem of underreporting, not only to authorities, but even also to untrained researchers. C, details that protecting confidentiality is essential to ensure both women's safety and data quality. D, details that research team members should be carefully trained and receive ongoing support, in that this type of research can produce emotional fatigue and safety considerations, of course, fear among the research team. The study design must be aimed at reducing any possible distress caused to the participants. Field workers need to be trained to refer women to services where they can access sources of support. And in countries where there are no such services, the research team is held responsible to create short-term service support mechanisms if these are needed by the women participating in the study. The findings, of course, should be properly interpreted and used to advance policy and intervention development. And violence questions, finally, 8, should only be incorporated into surveys designed for other purposes when ethical and methodological requirements can be met. In other words, instead of doing focalized and targeted research evaluations for violence against women, oftentimes to save money, questions about violence are incorporated into other surveys for other purposes, but this should not be done unless ethical and methodological requirements can be met. The next question has to do with whether there is a relationship between the number of female-headed households and crime rates. And related to this question, someone else on the course mentioned that microcredit programs were detailed in the module that increase economic independence of women and work as protective factors. And so I want to address both of these questions in my answer. The research suggests that the most important preventive mechanism concerning parenting is the quality of parenting given to children. So that is the crucial factor in the prevention of antisocial behavior. Obviously, it is often hard for one person, as opposed to two, to give quality parenting, and that is why you often see correlations between female-headed households and male-headed households, for that matter, and crime rates. But the most important thing in terms of parenting is the quality of parenting that is given to children as a protective factor preventing antisocial behavior. And yes, the module mentioned microcredit programs that increase women's economic independence. These programs have to be carefully managed. Why? Microcredit programs were not initially designed to deal with violence against women. Rather, they were designed purely as a measure to increase women's financial autonomy. As these programs matured, researchers realized that microcredit programs can be used to hopefully decrease instances of violence against women. But these programs need to be carefully thought out and managed so that, first of all, the microcredit goes directly to the women and indeed leads to her economic independence, not to increased coercion and threats on the part of her partner. So that is the caveat for microcredit programs that are indeed promising as they are perfected over time in the arena of preventing violence against women. The third question was, what models for community discussion and awareness raising about violence against women have been successful worldwide? And importantly, how should one develop community programs when the community itself has a highly ingrained machismo culture? These are very good questions. And for the answer to the first one, I would direct you to the Virtual Knowledge Center of UN Women online, which is available in various languages. In that knowledge center, there is a specific part that deals with community awareness raising campaigns and campaigns in general against violence against women. And this section of the Virtual Knowledge Center not only details campaigns, but gives some data about which elements of campaigns are successful, and these would be based, of course, on impact evaluations. The second part of the question was how one should develop community programs when the community itself has a highly ingrained machismo culture. And here I would give two suggestions. First of all, in any community, there are likely to be institutions or people who have a vested interest in preventing violence against women. And so the first way to proceed is to identify stakeholders that would be likely to support preventive efforts against violence against women. We can think of the schools, we can think of teachers, we can think of community health centers and nurses and doctors, and we can also think of businesses that employ women. It is in the interest of none of these stakeholders to have violence against women because it increases their workload. It has a negative repercussion on the children of women who are survivors of violence, and it obviously reduces the productivity of women who are employed in businesses that rely on them to produce. I would also say that many men can be convinced to support preventive actions towards violence against women if they are reminded that this violence not only affects their partners, but their mothers, sisters, and daughters. So keeping women safe is also in the interest of men, and they need to be included in preventive efforts. The fourth question was, what are the intersectional characteristics in Latin America and the Caribbean that are most prevalent in violence against women? And this question indeed shows that the students enrolled in this course are reading the module carefully and thinking about intersectionality, which was a key point of the module. Unfortunately, I do not know of any data or studies in the region that looks at intersectional characteristics and violence against women. But in the module, and I'm reproducing it here on this next slide, I introduced a table that detailed criteria, diversity criteria, that nations in the regions, governments, had chosen to be reflected or to include in their policies or national plans against violence against women. And so you see here the number of countries included from the region and the percentage of plans from this total that included various types of consideration for ethnic subgroups, geographic subgroups, cultural subgroups, various levels of socioeconomic status, linguistic minorities, sexual minorities, women living with HIV/AIDS, generational differences such as the elderly or the very young, and women who are challenged in some way, who have some kind of disability. The fifth question is, when living conditions in a community improve, the risk factors decrease and the protective factors improve, especially for vulnerable groups such as children and adolescents. So the question, therefore, is how can one convince with statistics local authorities, that is mayors, that it is more cost effective to invest in public policies aimed at prevention, because otherwise the state would have to spend its budget in investigating, processing, and punishing crime. This is a very important question and draws on a very small but consistent body of findings in criminology, which shows, as the person who posed this question, that yes, it is much less expensive for governments to prevent crime than for them to react to it. So here I would refer our students, our readers, to, again, the Virtual Knowledge Center for Ending Violence Against Women and Girls of UN Women, which has a section with data, with numbers for this very good argument that is to be made to local authorities. The data here is from around the world and includes data from the region, but specifically from the region, the IADB has data that is in this article, for which I provided the link below. I would say that there is an additional problem besides the lack of data. And perhaps our students will now be aware of this data, but it is a very limited body of research that, while it has given consistent results, isn't particularly well known and probably not in the region. However, there are other reasons why governments choose to react as opposed to prevent crime, and I think these are largely political reasons, given that prevention efforts are largely unseen and unattractive for public relations and for the press, whereas reactions to crime, crackdowns, special courts, police interventions, especially when they are hard-handed or mano dura, attract a lot of good attention for politicians and votes. And that is perhaps why there is a preference of governments to react to crime as opposed to preventing it. Thank you. And I will now ask Diego to answer his question.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, sorry for my delay. Second of all, I will like to giving you the excuses for my English. I will do my best, but it's not my main language, so I will try my best. So the first question is the last question that Professor Barberet answered, is by improving the living conditions of community, how can we give percentages of the benefit cost of prevention? So in the topic about prevention of youth violence, there's a lot of studies that shows that they are effective, that there are cost benefit. There are three main programs that I would like to show. One of them is the study by Greenwood et al. Found that the school-based prevention programs that targeted disadvantaged youths for graduating from high school were almost 10 times as cost effective as the three strikes approach. So the main thing that we can learn from this, that is sanction and punishment of crime, doesn't give many benefits, and in opposition, the prevention in high school and the retention of students is 10 times better for resolving the problem. And others two studies are a benefit cost analysis at age 40 found that Perry program produced more than $17 of benefit per dollar of cost. Head Start's short and medium term benefits could offset between 40% and 60% of its costs. For every dollar spent on the Child Parent Center program in Chicago, more than $7 was saved by society. This is a study by Welch and Farrington that provides many statistics, many studies about the effectiveness of this kind of prevention, and especially as an argument for those who support punishment and doesn't rely on prevention. I think that is very important for the political decisions, the public policy, to rely on studies and give a good review of these numbers and figures and statistics, because there's a lot of evidence in this field. And so prevention of youth violence is not only a good thing, it's not only an academic thing, it's an intervention that shows very good results in terms of solving the problems of youth violence and delinquency. The second question was is the role of the state in helping vulnerable groups at risk is undoubtedly important. It is effective to subsidize as only tool like the universal assignment for children in Argentina, assisting vulnerable groups with social work, community work, or school-based intervention. What have been successful in Latin America and the Caribbean region, working with vulnerable groups in order to avoid the permanent use of economic aids? This is a very good question and important one, because the key is to understand that the assistance of the state allows to reduce structural risk factors. But for this to have a real effect on prevention, the psychosocial intervention must be on the personal, family, group, and community level. This contributes to the sustainability of the effects of prevention, since interventions can lose their benefit if it is not accompanied by psychosocial programs. Assistance alone doesn't solve the problem. It can even have an opposite effect on dependence. So we can learn that in the course that the interventions in prevention, youth and violence should focus on many areas of the living of the groups and the people. Should focus on the personal level, the family level, the group level, the community level. So that combined with assistance and the help given from the state uh, should do a real effect on prevention of youth and violence. So I think that this question should apply to the risk factors, but we have known that in the course that protective factors, as the intervention provided by psychosocial interventions, should be a complement and uh, should develop a real effect on the problem. The third question is, obviously, the over-intervention does not work. It may even have more negative than positive effects. The people may feel used, overburdened, and overworked. To avoid this, an initial diagnostic that detects the program intervention and intervening in a territory. Sorry, the question is, has the multisectoral over-intervention functioning in targeted territories to prevent crime and violence? The multi-sector intervention often means that 7 or 8 programs are intervening in a neighborhood or community. This is a very good question, because in our experience, the focalization, the targeted group, is also the targeted group of many interventions from the state, since prevention has a story, has a background in preventing drugs, in preventing youth violence, in preventing many things that shows the intervention in the same territories and the same groups. So people in these territories feel overburdened, used, and overworked by many interventions in the present and in the past. To avoid this, an initial diagnosis that detects the programs and interventions that are intervening in a territory is fundamental. That way, the different agents, the different providers for intervention, meaning state, meaning civil society, should work collaterally, should work together to giving an intervention that is that should focus on many of the causes of the problem of delinquency and violence. So that the programs and the intervention should work together to achieve efficiency and effectiveness of prevention. The fourth question was, the prison population, I think that in Latin America, are mostly young. What would be the best public policy to avoid recidivism in those young prisoners? This is an important question, because prevention often is seen as a previous stage in the manifestation of violence and delinquency. But prevention is also should be seen as a work in prison and in the reentry programs, often in the community. There are many programs that work with young offenders. In the course, we have reviewed two with great results: restorative justice and cognitive behavioral models such as IDA. The important thing is to focus in a justice where jail is the last option, various treaties say so, and when people are convicted first, the system protects his, her rights, decrease imprisonment, improves management of the prisons, and increases the chances of reintegration of the people that are in jail. And second, programs that follows the principles outlined in the course. I think that mainly the focus on skills and competences should work better with this population and this problem in particular. One line of study that I like to show you is the desistance theory by Shadmaruna. There are three publications that are cited in this presentation. One is reintegration as a right and the rights of reintegration, how and why people stop offending, desistance and restorative justice, that are in the line of showing that skills, competences, and the protective factors should do a better work than focusing on risk factors. The last question was, I believe that the family must be strengthened through psychosocial programs that enhance the values for peaceful coexistence. It is no less important to pay attention to the psychological needs of young people. Families, schools, and communities are fundamental protective factors in this phase of life. I think it's a very important question because I agree that the families, schools, and communities are fundamental protective factors. But one factor that is often not work very consistent in psychosocial interventions is the peers. The peers, I think, is one of the main focus of prevention, youth violence, and delinquency. We must change our view of peer groups as a risk factor. They can be a protective factor. Therefore, community intervention with peers is central, strengthening the resources and skills of this group in order to contribute to prevention. I think that the focus on protective factors is a effective way of leading prevention of youth violence and delinquency. So in order to achieve that, we can work with the groups that is in the community and have an important effect on the lives of young people. That is one of the things that I like to enlighten is about Aulas en Paz. Aulas en Paz is a program developed in Colombia, also in intervention in Chile, and has a component that is work with peer groups and how to develop a better interaction with new skills and new competencies about resolving the problems of school violence in this case, but also the prevention of youth violence in general and delinquency, I think also. That is the 5 questions I have for answer. So we are going to answer the questions that are coming in the chat, that are coming live. Professor?
Okay, the question is, what are some interventions that have been evaluated in the prevention of youth violence and violence against women? I will say that in the area of violence against women, batterer intervention programs for men have been evaluated, and there are mixed results on their effectiveness. I will also say there is a fairly large body of research on restraining orders as a way to prevent violence against women. And again, there are some caveats or some cautions in relying on restraining orders as a way to prevent violence against women. In that it is not enough simply to have the order in the legal system and to issue it, but to ensure that women are connected to services in that, and also that if the order is violated, there is very quick notification of the authorities and follow through and sanctioning for violating a restraining order, since many indeed are violated. Those are two examples of some fairly substantive bodies of research in this area.
I also would like to complement with prevention of youth violence. There's a lot of programs that are working with cost effectiveness studies, and you can see the bancos de buenas prácticas. I don't think that are translated to English, that kind of interventions in Latin America, but also there are a lot of sites in the web that you can also see. There's a bank of good practices in Canada. There's a bank of good practices in the United States, the Crime Solutions, that shows that prevention in youth violence, focusing on protective factors and skills and competences, should be an effective way of preventing this kind of behavior and the effects of these behaviors in the communities and schools. So, another question. So, it seems that that was the last question. So, Professor Babret, if you would like to close the session.
Yes, I thank everybody for posing us such interesting questions and for participating in the live questions. We hope this module will be of use to you in your work as policymakers and practitioners, and would always be available by email to answer any other questions. Thank you.
So I would like to thank you all for participating in this session. The presentation should be available to all of you to see the links and studies that we have mentioned, and have a good afternoon or day or the rest of the day. Thank you very much.